Hello everyone, welcome again to another Teacher Joseph podcast. Some of you may already know the BBC World Service. It's a very famous radio channel which broadcasts news across the world. In recent years, it's been focusing only on Africa and parts of Asia, and it's left Europe behind. It costs a lot of money to run the BBC World Service, and who pays for it in recent years has also been under scrutiny, and regularly it appears in our headlines as the BBC and the government try to find a way to fund for its future. So again today, it's in the news, and we're going to read part of a story from The Guardian. The headline says, World Service, BBC bosses to call for full state funding. Now, up until fairly recently, maybe around 10 years ago, a little bit more, the BBC World Service was funded by the Foreign Office. That's our external government department. After all, it was giving news externally. Somebody somewhere decided that, well, it would be better if it was funded just like the BBC is funded, by taxpayer money and also by the licence fee. Of course, many people were protesting about this because they knew it would lead to a downplay of services. So here we are, around 10 years later from that decision. I think it may have been more than 10 years. I don't remember exactly when the BBC passed back the World Service into public control. But anyway, let's read now what it says. It says, the push to hand the costs of the BBC World Service back to the government is an early skirmish. That just means an early small argument, in what could be lengthy negotiations over its funding as part of the BBC's renewal process. Every so often, the BBC has to renegotiate its terms with the government. It says here, Jonathan Munro, the global director of BBC News, said the BBC World Service is a uniquely valuable asset that provides trusted, independent and impartial news to audiences around the world. As press freedom drastically reduces, disinformation thrives, and state-backed media advance aggressively. Its role is increasingly important. We need a sustainable, long-term funding solution that enables the BBC World Service to meet these global challenges and invest in services for the future. Before 2014, the government held sole responsibility for funding the World Service, an international news service available on radio, television, and online that provides news and analysis in more than 40 languages. However, as part of the cost-cutting measures pursued by the coalition government from 2010, the costs of providing the service were moved onto the BBC itself. So there we are, that's what I was mentioning a moment ago. It says here, under the latest funding settlement, 2/3 of the costs of the World Service come from the licence fee. That's the fee that all people in the UK have to pay if they own a television, with the rest from government grants. The World Service has already had to make cuts this year as the BBC struggles with the 2-year licence fee freeze. It was announced in January that 130 jobs would go as part of the plans to save about 6 million. Government sources said that all issues related to the BBC's funding will be examined as part of its renewal process. They also said the last spending review, including a 31% increase in the World Service's government funding for 2025 to 2026 to 137 million. The figure was 20 million less than the BBC had asked for during negotiations. A spokesperson for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office said the government highly values the BBC World Service, which reaches a global audience of 320 million and remains the world's most trusted international news service. So you can hear there that the BBC World Service is very much the elephant in the room. The BBC want the government to pay for it, and the government, of course, have already passed the charges, the amount to be paid for the World Service to the BBC by asking it to be paid via the licence fee and also by government grants. And it's been like that since 2014. Before that, it was funded fully by the government. So it looks like further discussion is necessary in order to try to fix it. I would imagine, just from my own experience of living in the UK and also knowing how the BBC works, I would imagine that eventually the BBC itself will evolve into a simple archive similar to perhaps Netflix or something like that, because it has wonderful comedies and shows, but it's also operating, I think currently, BBC One, BBC Two, there's many others, 3 and 4, and then there's the radio channels as well, BBC 1, 2, 3, 4, and a whole host of others, which are slowly being amalgamated and merged into each other. So we could be left with very little with live broadcasting and perhaps having an archive which people can dip into if they want. And there's already part of that in the process anyway. I think there is already an archive you can pay for, and there's already BBC iPlayer, which is holding the BBC's content. So it does seem a bit bizarre, all of this. And as usual, they tend to look inwards rather than the future. It's much easier to say, oh no, I think you should pay for this, instead of actually looking at the future of what the BBC World Service holds. Of course, the BBC World Service is a really amazing institution historically as part of the BBC, and it was indeed, I think, the voice of the British Empire as well at one stage. So it is no doubt a wonderful broadcasting system, and it has indeed made a wonderful contribution to the world. But is it still relevant? Because now its idea is simply to plant democracy in Africa and other parts of the world. So I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about its future. But anyway, it looks like big arguments are coming with regards to how it's going to be funded, if indeed it survives along with the BBC. And there we are. That's a news story from today. I hope you've enjoyed this. Let's talk soon. See you. Bye.